In the early days of World War II, a wave of fervent patriotism swept across Japan. Fueled by years of nationalistic education and state propaganda, the concept of the Hakko Ichi was promoted, justifying military expansion as a divine mission. Initial, swift victories against Allied forces in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, were celebrated with massive parades and flag-waving, reinforcing a belief in Japan's invincibility and spiritual superiority. This national pride was channeled into support for the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, an ideology promising to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. Propaganda posters adorned city streets, depicting victorious soldiers and a glorious future under the rising sun. For many ordinary citizens, the war felt distant but just. Life maintained a semblance of normalcy, though daily routines were increasingly colored by patriotic rallies and a growing sense of collective destiny. As the war progressed, the National Mobilization Law of 1938 granted the government sweeping powers to control the economy and civilian life. Factories that once produced textiles, toys, and bicycles were rapidly converted to manufacture munitions, aircraft parts, and ships. Skilled workers were conscripted into the military, leaving a massive labor gap that needed to be filled by any means necessary to feed the insatiable demands of the front lines. This gap was filled by a newly mobilized workforce. Women, previously confined to domestic roles, entered factories in unprecedented numbers. Students, even those in middle school, were organized into labor service corps and spent part of their day working on assembly lines or in fields. The elderly were also called upon to perform lighter tasks, all driven by the slogan, "Luxury is our enemy." This shift profoundly altered the social fabric and daily routines. The demands of total war quickly led to severe shortages as resources were diverted to the military. In 1941, rice rationing began, followed by controls on almost every conceivable item: miso, soy sauce, sugar, charcoal, clothing, and matches. Families depended entirely on ration books, which provided only a fraction of their pre-war consumption. Urban areas were hit hardest, as their access to locally grown food was non-existent. To survive, people became resourceful, cultivating victory gardens on any available patch of land, including rooftops and parks. The diet deteriorated drastically. Rice, the national staple, became a luxury, often mixed with barley or sweet potatoes. People foraged for edible wild plants, acorns, and even silkworm pupae to find protein. Black markets thrived, offering goods at exorbitant prices. But these were only accessible to the few with connections. Education was fundamentally repurposed as a tool for the state. School curricula were stripped of Western influences. The English language, for example, was banned from classrooms. It was replaced with intensified physical training, martial arts, and drills using wooden rifles, or sharpened bamboo spears in preparation for a potential Allied invasion. Loyalty to the emperor was the central tenet, taught as a divine obligation. Textbooks were aggressively rewritten to promote militarism and a sacred national identity, glorifying sacrifice and obedience. School days were no longer just for academic study. Students spent significant time in labor service, harvesting crops in the countryside or performing menial tasks in local factories. To support munitions production, the system was designed to shape an entire generation that was physically tough, ideologically pure, and willing to die for the nation. For the first few years, the Japanese home islands felt untouchable, protected by the perceived strength of the imperial military. This illusion was shattered in April 1942 by the Doolittle Raid. While the material damage was minimal, the psychological shock was profound. It proved that Japan was vulnerable, and the war, once a distant affair, could now reach their homes. This single event prompted a frantic, if initially disorganized, push for civil defense. In response, cities began organizing air raid drills. Citizens were instructed to dig rudimentary shelters, often little more than trenches or small bunkers in their backyards. Neighborhood associations formed bucket brigades, preparing to fight the fires they were told would come. The sound of the air raid siren, once a theoretical drill, became a regular and dreaded intrusion, signaling a new and terrifying reality where the sky itself was a source of danger. As Allied bombing campaigns intensified, particularly the shift to low-altitude incendiary raids in 1945, civilian defense became a desperate and grim necessity. The government relied heavily on the tonarigumi, or neighborhood associations. These small, compulsory groups of 10 to 15 households were responsible for everything from distributing rations to enforcing blackout rules and, most terrifyingly, firefighting. Their equipment was pitifully inadequate against the chemically fueled firestorms. Volunteers, including women, children, and the elderly, were armed with little more than buckets of water, sand, and long hooks to pull down burning structures to create fire breaks. They valiantly fought blazes that could engulf entire city blocks in minutes. This decentralized, under-equipped response was tragically ineffective against the industrial scale of the bombing. Amidst growing hardship, the government relentlessly promoted the spirit of endurance, or gamen. This cultural concept of stoically bearing the unbearable was elevated to a national virtue. Propaganda celebrated sacrifice, framing hunger, hard labor, and even the loss of loved ones as patriotic contributions to the war effort. The media was filled with stories of heroic soldiers and self-denying citizens, creating immense social pressure to conform and suppress any sign of weakness. This ideology, often called Seishinran spirit theory, argued that Japan's spirit was superior to the Allies' material wealth and technology. Citizens were told that willpower and unity could overcome any obstacle. This intense psychological campaign aimed to bolster morale and maintain social cohesion, demanding unwavering loyalty to the emperor and the nation even as the foundations of daily life crumbled under bombing and starvation. As the threat of devastating air raids became undeniable, the government initiated mass evacuations, or sakai, for school children in major cities. Starting in 1944, hundreds of thousands of children, typically from 3rd to 6th grade, were sent to the countryside. They were separated from their parents and housed in temples, inns, and local farmhouses, often supervised by their teachers. While intended for their safety, the experience was often traumatic. These urban children were separated from their families for months or even years, facing unfamiliar surroundings, food shortages that were sometimes just as bad as in the cities, and bullying from local children. The long-term emotional distress caused by this separation was a deep, hidden scar of the war for an entire generation. While Japan was slower than other nations to mobilize women into industrial labor, the sheer desperation of the late war period forced a change. Women stepped into factories, building aircraft and munitions, and took over agricultural work left by conscripted men. They also formed the backbone of civilian defense, organizing fire brigades and relief efforts through the Greater Japan Women's Association, to which nearly all adult women belonged. Unlike the Rosie the Riveter icon in the West, the Japanese propaganda ideal for women remained focused on the home. They were expected to be frugal home front wives, capable of managing on starvation rations, and, critically, to bear more children for the nation. Thus, women were trapped in a dual role, simultaneously expected to be modern industrial workers and traditional, sacrificing mothers, their contributions essential to keeping the nation functioning. The Japanese government maintained absolute control over information. Through the Cabinet Information Bureau, all news was filtered, censored, and crafted to support the war. Radios, which were in most homes, broadcast only the official narrative, glorious victories, heroic sacrifice, and the beastly nature of the enemy. Defeats, like the disastrous Battle of Midway, were completely suppressed or spun as strategic repositioning. This control was enforced by the Tako, or thought police, who ruthlessly stamped out any hint of dissent or unpatriotic talk. Neighbors in the Tonarigumi were encouraged to report on each other. This pervasive propaganda and surveillance created an atmosphere of paranoia, making it impossible for ordinary people to grasp the true, increasingly desperate state of the war. By 1944, the weight of invincibility began to crumble. The fall of Saipan was a critical turning point, as it put the home islands within range of American B-29 bombers, unleashing a new and terrible phase of the war. The official news still spoke of fighting spirit, but the relentless firebombing of cities, the meager rations, and the white ash-filled boxes returning in place of sons and husbands told a different story. While public defiance was maintained, private despair and war weariness became pervasive. People saw the government preparing for Ketsugo, the final defense of the homeland, by training civilians with bamboo spears. This grim preparation made the true situation clear. A dark, cynical humor emerged in private conversations, and while few dared to speak openly, a deep anxiety about the inevitable, catastrophic end replaced the patriotic fervor of the early war years. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber appeared over Hiroshima. The new kind of bomb it dropped detonated in a silent, blinding flash, unleashing a wave of heat and force that instantly incinerated the city center and killed tens of thousands. Survivors walked in a daze, skin hanging from their bodies, amidst a landscape of utter annihilation. The scale of the destruction was incomprehensible, unlike anything seen even in the worst firebombings. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb devastated the city of Nagasaki. The Japanese government, already reeling from Hiroshima and the Soviet declaration of war, was confronted with a weapon that could annihilate its population city by city. Beyond the immediate blast, a new, invisible killer emerged, radiation sickness, which claimed thousands more lives in the agonizing weeks and months that followed, adding a new layer of horror to the unbearable reality. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese public was told to gather by their radios for a momentous announcement. At noon, for the very first time, they heard the voice of Emperor Hirohito. The broadcast, known as the Gyokuan Hoso or Jewel Voice broadcast, was delivered in formal, archaic court Japanese that many common people struggled to understand fully. He never used the word surrender, but instead spoke of accepting the provisions of their joint declaration and enduring the unendurable. Despite the obscure language, the message was clear: the war was over. The reaction was one of profound shock and disorientation. People openly wept in the streets, not just from sadness, but from a complete collapse of the reality they had known. Their divine nation had been defeated, and the foundation of their world had vanished. The surrender plunged Japan into a state of kyodatsu, or collective exhaustion and despair. The nation's infrastructure was shattered, major cities were smoking ruins, and millions were homeless and starving. The government was paralyzed, and the black market became the only means of survival. A profound uncertainty and fear gripped the nation, especially regarding the impending arrival of the Allied occupation forces, who had been depicted as foreign devils for years. When the first American troops landed, the public braced for the worst. Instead, the occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began with a surprising lack of violence. The sight of G's handing out chocolate and chewing gum to children created a surreal sense of cognitive dissonance. This marked the beginning of a new, complex chapter, as Japan, for the first time in its history, was under foreign rule, initiating a period of rapid and forced transformation. From the ashes of 1945, Japan embarked on a monumental journey of reconstruction. Under Allied occupation, the nation was demilitarized and remade. A new constitution was drafted, renouncing war as a sovereign right and transforming the emperor from a living god into a human symbol of the state. This period was marked by hardship, but also by a frantic, determined energy to rebuild. The resilience and focus that had characterized the war effort were rechanneled into economic recovery. This effort would eventually lead to the post-war economic miracle. The war left deep and lasting scars, creating a national identity profoundly rooted in pacifism. The generation that lived through the firebombings, the shortages, and the atomic bombs would spend the rest of their lives grappling with the complex legacy of their nation's devastating conflict.